They say a man's home is his castle, but for me, it's my farm. And on that farm, my bridge is the drawbridge, my lifeline in and out. So, when strangers showed up and started tearing it apart without warning, they might as well have declared war. The morning started innocently enough. Coffee in hand, I stepped onto the porch to enjoy the peaceful hum of the countryside. But instead of birdsong, I heard it, a sharp, grinding roar from across the creek. My gut twisted. That sound wasn't just loud, it was intrusive, out of place, and most importantly, unwelcome. I didn't waste time wondering. Boots on, I marched toward the noise, Max trotting beside me like a furry shadow. As I crested the hill, I saw them, 3 men in bright vests, swarming over my bridge like it was an abandoned wreck. One barked orders, clipboard in hand, while the other 2 hacked at the wood with saws, splinters flying like confetti at some sick celebration. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cutting through the racket as I quickened my pace. "What the hell are you doing to my bridge?" The man with the clipboard looked up, a smug grin plastered on his face like he'd been waiting for this confrontation. "Morning, sir," he called out, his tone as fake as his courtesy. "We're here on behalf of the HOA. Just addressing a safety concern." I stopped dead in my tracks, blinking in disbelief. HOA? On my land? My bridge? It felt like I just walked into an alternate reality where people waltzed onto private property with power tools and a sense of entitlement. "Let me get this straight," I said, closing the distance between us. "You're tearing down my bridge because the HOA told you to?" "That's correct," he replied, not even flinching. "This structure doesn't meet community safety standards. It's a liability." I couldn't help but laugh, but there was no humor in it. "A liability to who?" I snapped. "The squirrels? The deer? In case you haven't noticed, this is private property, and you're trespassing." The man didn't miss a beat. "The HOA has jurisdiction over this entire area, sir," he said, flipping through his papers as if they held the secrets of the universe. "We're just doing our job." "Jurisdiction?" I gestured broadly to the open fields, the barn in the distance, the creek running under the very bridge they were dismantling. "Buddy, you're miles off the HOA's map. Unless you've got some magical authority that rewrites property lines, you're breaking the law." The clipboard guy opened his mouth, probably to spout more bureaucratic nonsense, but one of the workers, a burly guy with arms like tree trunks, cut in. "Look, man," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We're just following orders. You've got a problem, take it up with the HOA board." "Oh, I will," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "But first, let me make something very clear. If you don't stop what you're doing right now, you're going to have 2 problems. 1. I pointed at the power saw still buzzing in the worker's hands, "You won't have that saw anymore." And 2, I let out a sharp whistle, and Max leapt forward, growling low and deep, his teeth bared like a wolf ready to strike. Max is a good dog. Loyal. Friendly. But he's also 90 pounds of muscle and pure intimidation, and he knows when it's time to play bad cop. The 2 workers froze, their eyes darting between me and Max. Clipboard guy tried to keep his cool, but I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice a little higher pitched now. "No," I said, smiling coldly. "That's a promise. Now pack up and get off my property before Max decides he doesn't like trespassers." For a moment, no one moved. Then the big guy muttered, "Screw this," and started packing up the tools. Clipboard guy looked like he wanted to argue, but one sharp bark from Max changed his mind. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind a half-dismantled bridge and a mess of wood and nails. As their truck disappeared down the road, I stood there, surveying the damage with Max at my side. The bridge was my only way in and out, and now it was barely holding together. My hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just about the bridge, it was about principle. They thought they could walk all over me, but they were dead wrong. Well, Max, I said, scratching his ears as he wagged his tail. Looks like the HOA just made a big mistake. And I was going to make sure it was their last. The morning after the fiasco with the bridge, I was still seething. Every time I glanced out the window and saw the half-demolished structure, my blood pressure spiked. That bridge wasn't just some random pile of wood, it was a piece of my life. It had withstood storms, floods, and even a questionable attempt to haul a tractor over it, a memory that still made me wince. But apparently, it didn't meet the HOA's precious standards. I couldn't decide what pissed me off more, the audacity or their stupidity. I wasn't going to let it slide. After finishing my coffee, and trust me, I needed every last drop, I grabbed my truck keys. Max jumped into the passenger seat without needing an invitation. He could sense it. Today wasn't going to be a quiet day on the farm. My first stop was the HOA office. If you've never had the misfortune of stepping into one, let me paint the picture: beige walls, motivational posters about community harmony, and a receptionist who looked like she hated her job even more than I hated being there. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone as lifeless as the fake potted plants decorating the lobby. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge of tearing down bridges that don't belong to them," I replied, plastering on the kind of smile that wasn't fooling anyone. Her eyes flicked up from her computer, clearly unimpressed. "Do you mean the HOA president?" "Yeah," I said, leaning on the counter. "Let me guess. Mid-50s, clipboard glued to her hand, thinks she's queen of the world?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly deciding whether to argue or ignore my sarcasm. Before she could respond, the door behind her opened, and out walked the woman of the hour. Marcy. Or, as I'd come to think of her, the clipboard queen. She was exactly as I'd pictured, immaculately dressed, perfectly polished, and radiating the kind of arrogance that only came from years of unchecked power. Her smile was so fake it could have been a Halloween mask. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Oh, absolutely," I said, stepping forward. "You can start by explaining why your little demolition crew tore apart my bridge yesterday." Her smile didn't waver, but I caught the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Ah, you must be Mr. Carter," she said smoothly. "We sent you a notice last month regarding the bridge." "No, you didn't," I shot back. "What you sent me was a glossy brochure full of HOA propaganda and vague nonsense about community improvements. My property isn't within your jurisdiction, so you have no right to touch anything on it. Care to explain?" Marcy clasped her hands in front of her clipboard, the picture of fake patience. "The HOA has a responsibility to maintain safety and aesthetic standards for the community," she began, her tone as rehearsed as a bad infomercial. "Your bridge posed a significant liability." "A liability to who?" I interrupted, crossing my arms. "The cows? The squirrels? Lady, I'm the only one who uses that bridge. And even if it was a problem, you still had no right to step foot on my land, let alone destroy my property." Her smile tightened, the cracks in her composure starting to show. "The HOA has the authority to address community concerns, Mr. Carter. If you disagree with our actions, you're welcome to file a formal complaint." "Oh, I'll do more than that," I said, my voice low. "I'll see you in court before I let you and your clipboard mafia get away with this." For the first time, her smile faltered. Just a little. She wasn't used to people pushing back, and it was throwing her off. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "if that's how you feel, then I suppose the legal system will decide. But I should warn you, Mr. Carter, the HOA has a very thorough legal team." "Great," I replied, turning toward the door. "I hope they're thorough enough to explain why you're trespassing on private property and committing fraud. Should make for an interesting case." As I walked out, I could feel her eyes burning holes into my back. That was fine. I wasn't finished with her yet, not by a long shot. Back at home, I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. If Marcy wanted a fight, I was more than happy to give her one. I pulled out every document I had, property deeds, tax records, county maps. Sure enough, my farm was miles outside the HOA's official boundaries. Even better, I found a letter from the county explicitly denying their request to expand jurisdiction into my area. They'd tried to annex nearby properties a year ago, and the county had shut them down cold. Feeling pretty smug, I made a call to an old friend who worked at the county records office. He owed me a favor after I helped him with a tractor repair last spring. Within an hour, I had copies of the HOA's rejection letter, their bylaws, and even some juicy meeting minutes where Marcy and her crew discussed their plans to assert influence over nearby landowners. Oh, it was game on. But as I dug deeper, I realized something: this wasn't just about me. Marcy and her HOA had been bullying people for years. My neighbor Jim, a retired cop, had been fined for having an unapproved chicken coop that had been there since the 80s. Lisa, a single mom running an organic farm, had her irrigation pipes mysteriously sabotaged after refusing to pay some bogus access fee. By the time I'd talked to half a dozen neighbors, it was clear this wasn't an isolated incident. Marcy and her clipboard army weren't just overstepping their boundaries, they were stomping all over them. By the time I finished gathering stories from my neighbors, the picture was clear. Marcy and her HOA weren't just pushing limits, they were outright bulldozing them. Every story was worse than the last. There was Greg, the quiet guy with a small orchard, fined for putting up a deer-proof fence that didn't align with the aesthetic of the HOA, even though his property wasn't in their jurisdiction. Lisa had been forced to spend thousands repairing her irrigation system after someone mysteriously cut her pipes. And Jim, the retired cop? He had a binder full of letters from the HOA demanding compliance over everything from his barn color to his grass height, none of it enforceable, of course, but they were counting on people not knowing any better. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore. This was personal for all of us. We decided to meet up at Jim's place. His kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and bacon, which helped take the edge off the bitterness of what we were there to do. Around the table sat me, Jim, Lisa, and 3 other neighbors who had been burned by the HOA. Jim spread out a county map on the table, the official HOA boundary marked in green. "This is where their jurisdiction legally ends," Jim said, stabbing his finger at the map. Sure enough, it stopped well short of my property, as well as Lisa's, Greg's, and Jim's. Then he pointed to a larger area outlined in red. "And this is where they've been issuing fines, sending notices, and pulling stunts like your bridge." "Let me guess," I said, leaning forward. "They didn't get permission for this so-called expansion." "Not even close," Jim replied, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "The county shut them down when they tried. But they've been pretending otherwise." Lisa shook her head, her frustration evident. "And nobody stopped them?" "The county doesn't care," Jim said with a shrug. "Until someone makes enough noise." "Well, they're about to hear us loud and clear," I said, holding up the rejection letter I'd gotten from my buddy at the records office. "This proves they've been lying about their jurisdiction. We've got them on trespassing, fraudulent fines, and probably a dozen other violations." As we pieced everything together, the scope of the HOA's antics became even more absurd. Lisa shared how they'd threatened her with legal action if she didn't pay the bogus access fee they'd slapped on her property. "They said it was for road maintenance," she scoffed. "Funny thing is, I maintain that road myself. Haven't seen a single HOA truck out there." Greg, who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say, chimed in. "They fined me for the fence, saying it didn't match the community aesthetic," he said, shaking his head. "The fence doesn't even face their property. it's on the back of my orchard. And don't get me started on their compliance checks, Jim added, flipping through his binder of HOA notices. They stopped by once to measure my grass, like they had any authority to do that. I laughed them off my property, but not everyone knows they're bluffing. By the time we finished swapping stories, we had a mountain of evidence against Marcy and her clipboard army. It was enough to make anyone squirm. But we knew that gathering proof wasn't enough. If we wanted to take them down, we needed to hit them where it hurt, their reputation. Lisa took charge of the media side. She had a friend at the local paper who was more than happy to dig into a story about HOA corruption. Jim, with his law enforcement background, volunteered to help gather more evidence, especially anything that could prove criminal behavior. And me? Well, let's just say I was more than ready to take the gloves off. Our first big move was getting the word out. Lisa's friend agreed to run a feature story about HOA overreach, complete with interviews and photos of the damage they'd caused. Meanwhile, I turned to social media. Now, I'm not much of an internet guy, but even I knew the power of a well-placed Facebook post. Within hours of sharing the story, my inbox was flooded with messages from other locals who'd had run-ins with the HOA. One message stood out, a former HOA board member who'd quit after clashing with Marcy. "She runs the HOA like a dictatorship," the message read. Most of us just went along with it because we didn't want to deal with her wrath. But everything you're saying? It's all true, and worse. Worse? I muttered, staring at the screen. Oh, I was all ears. The next day, Lisa's article hit the front page of the local paper. The headline read, "HOA overreach, residents speak out against corruption." It was a masterpiece of small-town journalism. The piece included interviews with me, Lisa, Jim, and Greg, along with photos of the half-dismantled bridge, Lisa's damaged irrigation pipes, and Jim's infamous, unapproved, chicken coop. It also detailed the HOA's failed attempt to expand their jurisdiction and hinted at financial mismanagement within the organization. By noon, the whole town was buzzing. At the feed store, the diner, even the post office, people were talking about Marcy and her clipboard brigade. And the best part? Not a single person was on their side. That afternoon, just as I was getting ready to check on the cows, my phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, "HOA financial records, confidential." Frowning, I opened it. Inside was a single line of text, "Thought you might find this useful." Attached were dozens of scanned documents, budgets, expense reports, and emails between Marcy and the other board members. As I scrolled through the files, my jaw dropped. It was worse than I'd imagined. Payments for landscaping services that didn't exist. Invoices for security upgrades that were never installed. And then there was the kicker, thousands of dollars in fines collected from properties outside their jurisdiction, all funneled into a special projects fund with no clear explanation. I forwarded the email to Lisa, Jim, and Greg, then picked up the phone. "Lisa," I said when she answered, "did you see the email I just sent?" "Oh, I saw it," she replied, her voice tight with anger. This is a smoking gun if I've ever seen one. The HOA's next monthly meeting was scheduled for that Saturday, and the timing couldn't have been better. By then, we'd spent the week rallying support, gathering evidence, and spreading the word. When the day finally arrived, the community center was packed, standing room only. People who normally wouldn't give the HOA the time of day were now front and center, ready to see Marcy and her clipboard empire crumble. Marcy, ever the picture of control, walked into the room with her usual air of authority. She was dressed to the nines in a sharp blazer, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon of bureaucracy. She took her place at the front of the room and smiled her signature fake smile at the crowd. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her tone syrupy sweet. "Thank you all for coming. As always, our goal is to maintain the safety and harmony of our community. Now, let's start with the agenda. Hold on a second, I said, standing up from my seat near the back of the room. My voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, silencing the room. Before you dive into your agenda, I've got a few things we need to address. Marcy's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered. Mr. Carter, she said, her tone straining to stay polite. This is a structured meeting. If you have a question, we'll address it during the open forum. Oh, I don't have a question, I said, holding up a thick stack of papers. I have evidence. Evidence that your HOA has been operating far outside its jurisdiction, issuing illegal fines, and funneling money into questionable projects. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers, the tension palpable. Marcy's face paled, but she forced a tight-lipped smile. I'm not sure what you're referring to, she said, her voice wavering just slightly. Let me spell it out for you, I replied, stepping forward. This, I held up a county map with the HOA's official boundaries clearly marked in green, is where your authority ends. And this, I pointed to a larger red-marked area that included properties like mine, Lisa's, and Jim's, is where you've been issuing fines and notices. Care to explain how that's legal? Marcy opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Lisa stood up, holding her own stack of papers. And what about these financial records, she said, her voice sharp and clear. Payments for landscaping services that were never performed. Invoices for security upgrades that don't exist. Thousands of dollars in fines collected from people who aren't even in your jurisdiction. Marcy's smile disappeared completely, replaced by a tight, nervous expression. I don't know where you got those, she stammered. But I can assure you, the HOA operates with full transparency. Oh, really? Jim chimed in, standing up and holding up a printout of an email. Because this email from you, instructing the board to find creative ways to encourage compliance from non-members, doesn't sound very transparent to me. The crowd was no longer whispering. People were shouting questions, demanding answers, and calling for accountability. Marcy looked like a deer caught in headlights, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a lifeline. This is absurd, she finally exclaimed, her voice rising above the chaos. These accusations are baseless. The HOA has always acted in the best interest of the community. And yet, I said, my tone calm but cutting, you've been collecting fines from properties you have no authority over, trespassing on private land, and using those funds for who knows what. Sounds more like self-interest than community interest to me. The room erupted again, louder this time. People who'd been silent for years were now standing up, sharing their own stories of harassment and overreach by the HOA. The noise was deafening, and Marcy was visibly struggling to maintain control. Eventually, one of the other board members, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood up and raised his hands. I think we need to call for a vote, he said, his voice shaky. It's clear the community has concerns. A vote on what? Marcy snapped, her voice dripping with anger. On your removal as president, he replied, avoiding her glare. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into cheers and applause. Marcy's face turned beet red. You can't be serious, she hissed. After everything I've done for this community. Everything you've done to this community, I corrected, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. The vote was swift and unanimous. Within minutes, Marcy was officially removed from her position as HOA president. The county, which had been alerted to the financial discrepancies, announced that they would be launching a full investigation into the HOA's operations. Marcy stormed out of the room, her clipboard hanging limply at her side, the weight of her downfall finally sinking in. As for the rest of us, we walked out of that meeting with our heads held high. The board promised to cover the cost of repairing my bridge, and Jim, Lisa, and Greg all got their fines refunded. But more importantly, the entire community finally stood up to Marcy and her clipboard empire, and won. The fallout from the HOA's collapse rippled through the town like a wildfire. By the next morning, Marcy's name had become synonymous with overreach and corruption. At the diner, people were calling her "clipboard queen" between bites of pancakes. At the hardware store, they joked about setting up a Marcy-free zone around the town. And at the post office, one old-timer muttered, "Guess she finally clipped her own wings." The town had a way of turning scandal into comedy, and Marcy was now the punchline. But while the community seemed ready to move on, I wasn't done just yet. I still had a bridge to rebuild, both literally and figuratively. The damage she'd caused wasn't going to fix itself, and there was one loose end that needed tying up. 3 days after the meeting, I was out by the creek, taking measurements for the repairs, when Max let out a low growl. Not the "I saw a rabbit" kind of growl, the kind that says someone's here who shouldn't be. I glanced up and saw a figure trudging down the hill toward me. It was Rick, the former HOA treasurer. He looked worse for wear, his suit rumpled and his tie askew, but there was something about his expression that told me this wasn't a social visit. "Morning, Rick," I called, leaning on my measuring tape. "What brings you out here?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck like a man with a heavy burden to share. "Thought you'd want to know what's happening with the investigation," he said, his voice low. I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "It's bad. Real bad," he admitted, letting out a long sigh. Turns out Marcy wasn't just skimming off the top. She was funneling HOA funds into her personal accounts. The county's already found over $50,000 in misappropriated money, and they're still digging. I let out a low whistle. 50 grand? That explains all those special projects she was so fond of. Rick nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. The board's in full-blown damage control mode. They're offering refunds to everyone who was fined illegally, but the HOA's basically broke now. Most of the board members have resigned, and the county's stepping in to oversee things until they can figure out what to do next. "Well," I said, crossing my arms, "maybe they'll think twice before pulling stunts like this again." Rick nodded again but didn't say much more. He shuffled off after a brief goodbye, leaving me to mull over the news. The HOA was in shambles, Marcy was likely facing criminal charges, and the community was finally free of her dictatorship. Justice had been served, but there was still work to be done. The board had agreed to cover the cost of my bridge repairs, but I wasn't about to trust them with the job. Instead, I hired a local contractor, an old friend of Jim's who knew his way around a toolbox and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. It took a few days, but watching the new planks go down felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. Not just the bridge, but the principle of it all. The day the repairs were finished, I stood by the creek with Max at my side, watching as the workers packed up their tools. The bridge was solid, sturdy, and better than it had ever been. I reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. "Well, boy," I said with a smile, "guess we showed them what happens when you mess with the wrong farmer." Max wagged his tail in agreement, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as if daring anyone to try again. Word around town was that Marcy had skipped town shortly after the investigation was announced. Nobody knew where she'd gone, but rumors were flying. Some said she'd checked into a wellness retreat. Others claimed she was hiding out in her sister's basement. Jim, ever the optimist, had his own theory: she probably holed up in some HOA-free neighborhood where she can't boss anyone around. Lisa laughed at that. If such a place even exists. With Marcy and her clipboard brigade out of the picture, the community began to heal. Neighbors who'd been at odds over fines and petty disputes started working together again. Lisa's irrigation system was fully restored, Greg's deer fence stayed exactly where it was, and Jim, bless his heart, started hosting informal town hall meetings at his place to make sure the HOA didn't try to rise from the ashes. As for me, I went back to my quiet routine. Feeding the chickens, fixing fences, and sipping coffee by the creek while Max kept watch. Life felt normal again, though I kept one eye on the horizon, just in case another clipboard-wielding menace decided to test their luck. A few weeks later, I received an official letter from the county. It stated that the HOA's jurisdiction had been permanently reduced to its original boundaries, far, far away from my farm. I couldn't help but grin as I read it. The letter was more than just a piece of paper, it was a victory. A reminder that sometimes, standing your ground is all it takes to bring down an empire. I framed the letter and hung it in my barn, right next to a photo of the rebuilt bridge. It was my way of saying, never again. And if anyone like Marcy ever dared to cross that bridge, well, let's just say Max and I would be ready.